As if it hasn't been said already, welcome to New York. My name's, so many friends in the audience, this is amazing. My name's Ryan Gensler, I'm the Executive Vice President of CareerWise USA, and I'm so thrilled to have you all here. I'm thrilled to be here. This started as such a little pet project and has become this incredible movement that all of you are part of, and I'm so honored to be a part of it. This next panel is a really exciting one. We have two both governor and presidential appointed members of this panel representing education and labor. And as we've heard so much of the collaboration, the public-private partnership here in New York City, we are going to pull up a little bit and look at a federal lens, nationally, what's going on in this youth apprenticeship space, and how are we moving this niche thing to a nationwide movement. So I'm very honored to have Manny Lamar, Senior Policy Advisor for U.S. Department of Labor, and Luke Ryan, our Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Department of Education. So, sit down here real quick. We know that apprenticeship has been maybe underinvested in the past in this country, but that has been changing. Several administrations now in a row have been investing significantly in apprenticeship. And this movement of apprenticeship is growing here. So I'm excited to talk with you both about what that actually means for everybody here in the audience. We'll start with you, Luke. Secretary Cardona has been pushing raise the bar. What exactly is that?
Sure. So first off, happy afternoon, happy Wednesday, happy National Apprenticeship. This is a Youth Apprenticeship Conference. This is awesome. As Ryan said, my name is Luke Ryan. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education in Ed. Who is familiar with OCTAE? I got a couple hands. Good. We do four big things. The first is we administer federal Perkins program, which is a $1.4 billion investment to support about 12 million secondary and post-secondary students who participate in career and technical education. The second thing that we do is we administer Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which is the Adult Education and Family Literacy Program. Supports just shy of 1 million learners, and it's about an $800 million investment. The third thing that we lead is correctional education, and we are incredibly excited about the full reinstatement of Pell for incarcerated learners and confined learners as of this last July. So many of your states are working on applications and very excited about that. And the fourth thing that we do is provide support for community and technical colleges across our country, more than 1,000 institutions, and just about 40% of our nation's undergraduate enrollment. All right, so raise the bar is the Secretary's kind of bold vision for our P12 system. There are essentially 6 pillars within that work. The first 2 focus on academic acceleration and extended learning time. So really taking advantage of both how we put students back on track and making sure that they have a well-rounded learning experience that exists both in schools and in their communities. The second 2 focuses around supports for students and supports for educators. So specifically students, we focus on social emotional learning as well as mental health. And for educators, we are focusing on supporting our educator pipeline, which includes registered apprenticeship and education. And then the last 2 focus around pathways for global competitiveness. And the first strand focuses on multilingualism and really recognizing that multi-language or multi-talent are people with multi-language skills are essentially, they have a superpower. And we're really working to ensure that we bolster language acquisition within schools. And then the second area is the Unlocking Career Success Initiative. And within our Unlocking Career Success Initiative, we're seeking to transform high schools across the country through really 4 big levers of change. The first is dual enrollment, both in academic and technical subject areas. The second is work-based learning, which we are all familiar with. The third is industry credential attainment, and the fourth is career navigation. And what I love about Unlocking Career Success and Youth Apprenticeship is those 4 policy areas are in lockstep. They are one and the same. And we are excited to support this endeavor, and that is raise the bar in a nutshell.
There's a lot in that, and a lot of good for apprenticeship, youth apprenticeship, quite aligned there, so appreciate that focus. We'll get into what that means a little bit practically and some of the challenge that you might help overcome as we continue this conversation. Manny, on the labor side, there's this major effort to modernize, diversify, and expand apprenticeship. What exactly does that mean when you think about that at a federal level?
Absolutely. Thank you. And Ryan, always great to be here and great to be with you all. And I feel like Luke and I, we have kind of like a partnership and bond in terms of these engagements, aligning both with Department of Labor and Department of Education. So just want to appreciate the collaboration with Department of Education and you all. So just really quickly, I'll just mention, I'll be succinct with this because later on I want to tie into what we're doing specifically around our youth employment strategy. But in particular, when we talk about apprenticeship, we talk about registered apprenticeships. Quite frankly, in the past few years with the administration, we've invested over $440 million, over almost $500 million into registered apprenticeships. And those investments have meant a few key things and a few key priorities. When we talk about registered apprenticeships, we're talking about expanding, we're talking about diversifying, and we're talking about modernizing. And so I just kind of take a step back to kind of talk about just really quickly what we mean by that. But it really means kind of, we see it as kind of three key things. The first thing is when we talk about expanding registered apprenticeships, it's from a lens of equity. And the way we mean that tangibly in operation is that one, how do we expand registered apprenticeships to ensure populations that have access to these emerging and growing industries? So when we talk about women, when we talk about young people, like how do we actually meaningfully connect young people, people of color, to registered apprenticeship, because we know, quite frankly, it is the gold standard of work-based learning, or at least we see it that way. The second thing it means is around partnerships. And what we mean by that is, I know partnership seems kind of almost cliche at this point, but it's like, how do we connect and coordinate and align registered apprenticeship both into the education system and as well as the workforce system? And so what that means is, and I'll give some examples really quickly, is how are we aligning with, let's say our Office of Workforce Investment that oversees WEO at the publicly funded workforce system, and that's an avenue for training and supportive services. How do we coordinate and align that conversation to happen in a meaningful way? And how do we set clear guidance, quite frankly, to the system to align the languages a little bit better? And the third thing is just, quite frankly, is continuing to ensure that it's quality, that we maintain the consistent of that gold standard around the quality. But that's kind of been the big pieces. And of course, we've supported that with both follow-up policy as well as investments, whether it's our state investments, our state apprenticeship and expansion of formula dollars, both the competitive and formula dollars, or our Apprenticeship Building America investments that we've had, where we specifically have pre-apprenticeship and youth apprenticeship, specifically as opportunities to really build capacity. And the other thing I'll just mention is that we're taking, and how we're kind of going about it is really kind of leveraging and hearing, because registered apprenticeship, again, as a gold standard, is industry-driven, right? It's industry-driven. And when we talk about youth apprenticeship, we also want to continue to be industry-driven, but also ensure that there's strong alignment with education. And for that, I'll also just give a shout out to our Apprenticeship Advisory Committee that's been super important and influential in that role. And I know I saw Noah Ginsberg, one of our co-chairs, just been phenomenal in helping to kind of drive that conversation around expanding, modernizing, and diversifying registered apprenticeship. But in a succinct way, that's what it's meant. And our investments has followed, our policies have followed, and then the partnerships and the collaboration have followed as well.
Yeah, I think that idea that we often talk about at CareerWise, that this is business-led and student-centered. Youth apprenticeship is unique in that sense. And in order to do that, we're also bringing together our departments of labor, departments of education, these sometimes siloed systems. We see that here very clearly, right? We've got CTE, related instruction, coming from our CTE divisions out of the Department of Ed. And we've got apprenticeship sitting in the labor space. And that kind of siloing and division can sometimes make things complicated when systems aren't talking to each other. So I want to dig into that a little bit, and I want to first start by leveraging both of your experiences at the state level. Luke, when you were the Deputy Secretary of Education in Delaware. And Manny, when you were running the governor's Office of Workforce Innovations in Nevada, how did you experience that challenge of those two systems trying to work together or sometimes not working together well? And what are the things that are working that we should be pursuing at the state level?
I'll start. As Ryan mentioned, so before my role here, I was the ED, Executive Director in the Governor's Office. So for some context, that office coordinated and aligned with the publicly funded workforce system. We also oversaw the apprenticeship system, as well as coordinate with the higher ed and secondary system. And so I'll mention what some concrete challenges were, because I actually do think it mirrors some of the opportunities. So the concrete challenges and in very concrete, like here's some examples of what we did to try to mitigate some of those challenges, and which I would encourage you all, as you're having conversation at the state and local level, to think about these pieces. So the first and most obvious one was actually the challenge of language. So we'll say related technical instruction as an example, but we really just mean classroom instruction. And so I sound way smarter by saying really RTI when it just means classroom instruction. And so we would be kind of talking in circles about what we actually mean. So the first challenge is a challenge of language. But that, quite frankly, is kind of easier to get at. But the harder challenge is a challenge of integration and aligning. Because, I often joke and say, a lot of these, at the federal level, all these policies are cousins of each other. So WIOA, Perkins, ESSA, Apprenticeship, NAA, in many ways, there are really, they're close cousins. They can interact and you have a great relationship with your cousins, or it can be a bit challenging. But they're still part of your family whether you like it or not. So, and so I think the second challenge is a challenge of integration, and how do we actually break down those silos? And I'll actually give some very concrete examples of what we did to break those down. And so when we talk about integration and aligning, so one of the first things I actually did was that our CTE director, Chris Nelson, at that time at the Department of Ed, so I was in the governor's office, but I oversaw the apprenticeship system inside of the state workforce board. I said, Chris, we need you on the apprenticeship. So when we were restructuring our apprenticeship council, so of course, as many of you know, there's state apprenticeship agencies and Office of Apprenticeship States, and the SAAs have apprenticeship councils. I had Chris, I said, you have to sit on our apprenticeship council. Because when we're having these conversations, these nuanced conversations, we actually need a voice that could speak to the CTE lens in a much more deeper and richer way to integrate the system. So we added CTE as part of our apprenticeship council, and we added CTE as a seat on the workforce board. Now that meant some challenges. That meant that seats meant somebody else was going to have that seat. But we thought it was so important. And when we talk about integration, it wouldn't be really meaningful if we didn't have that. So that's one example. Another example is, sorry.
I was just going to say that should be a requirement.
But we had them as seat. The second thing is, when I leveraged the funding, so we got apprenticeship dollars, right? So we talk about this all the time about funding. It was in a way, once you build those partnerships and relationships, you can really actually, it's not just about my organization. So we said, hey, I have got funding from OA, Department of Labor, or Office of Apprenticeship, and I actually funded a navigator position in the higher ed system, an apprenticeship navigator in the higher ed system. And it was saying, look, I'll take away $100,000, $200,000 from the funds that was coming to our agency, and I'll literally shift it over to you to ensure that we're actually all building the system like all together, as opposed to like just building it one way or the other. And the third concrete example was I leveraged Governor's Reserve funding. So some of you all may be familiar with Governor's Reserve funding. And one of the things that we had talked about was the importance of the alignment with industry recognized credentials. And so work with the Department of Education, and we work with our workforce board to, one, identify a list of industry recognized credentials, but then two, say we will even fund. So I carved out a particular section of the Governor's Reserve funding to actually fund credentials for secondary students that needed to, whether we're talking about IT, healthcare, so on, whatever was our priority industries at that time, and we actually would fund that. And so I say that to say then, when we were having policy conversation, when we had funding conversation, they had a seat at the table, and they not only had a seat at the table, but they had a clear point of connection and accountability and relationship that made it, quite frankly, a lot easier to really talk about integration. So at the federal level, and I'll pause not to go too long, we're doing some of the same things, but I'll talk about that later so I could turn it to Luke.
So I'll start with at the federal level. And I think, your departments of labor, your departments of education, they are two cornerstones of this work. But this universe is a whole lot bigger. And there's a whole lot of money that is rolling out federally through investing in America. So there's $1.2 trillion that's rolling out through the bipartisan infrastructure law, which are largely going to your state and local departments of transportation. There is $370 million that's rolling out through the CHIPS and Science Act. And there's $270 billion rolling out through the Inflation Reduction Act. That is a $2 trillion investment that will be made over the next really 5 to 7 years. And right, your departments of energy, your departments of commerce, your departments of transportation, your departments of education, your departments of labor, right, all of those entities, state or local, are going to play a big role in how you coordinate those resources. The number one thing that connects all of those resources that are being deployed federally is your workforce strategy. And the things that we are absolutely advocating for are career and technical education, community and technical colleges, registered apprenticeship, and those three things are in pretty much every notice of funding opportunity, whether it rolls out to an agency or it rolls out to a private employer. They are required to have a training strategy that is attached to those dollars. Right? So this is $2 trillion that's rolling out through formula and discretionary grants. Like how you organize your communities, how you organize your states today is going to put you in a position to A, leverage those funds, and B, you will put yourself in a better position for those competitive dollars, those discretionary grants. Right? So this strategy that you are leading locally and at the state level is absolutely essential to how your state and your community tells its story and how it acquires those resources. So that's I'll back in then to the local. So at the local level or at the state level, I worked for Governor Carney and then Governor Markell before Governor Carney. And I worked in the Delaware Department of Ed, where I led the state's CTE system, the state's higher ed system, Ed Prep, and then the state's licensure and certification division. And our strategy from day one was we needed the Department of Education, we needed the Department of Labor, we needed the state community college, and we needed our state workforce board, which is an employer-focused organization, as well as community partners. So we actually had two community-based organizations, the Rodell Foundation and the United Way of America. That is the team that we wanted to assemble. We thought that collectively, if we could bring those organizations together and we could chart a shared North Star around how we support youth employment, we could really move mountains. And to Manny's point, we were policy advocates for one another. We worked to braid resources with one another. And we really made sure that we were able to align kind of our storytelling and our student experience collectively. And that was really the difference maker. So today in Delaware, 70% of students in grades 9 through 12 are enrolled in a high-quality career pathway program. It is the majority experience of students in the state. It's the number one way kids earn college credit. It's the only way that they earn credentials and work-based learning experiences. So, anyway, partnerships really matter, and over time you can have a substantial impact if you commit to those things.
And can I add to, just really quickly, one of the things, so to Luke's point, at the federal level, and I guess I should have probably said this in the beginning, within the DOL, I'm in the Employment Training Administration, and so, a key piece within ETA is the overseeing WIO, the publicly funded workforce system, but we also have the Office of Apprenticeship, that's also within ETA as well. But one thing I just wanted to add on the federal side that's important to mention is that, about a year or so ago, we launched our youth employment work strategy. And the youth employment work strategy really focused, it's been almost 2 decades since the department articulated a clear youth strategy. And our youth strategy, one, in addition to align with everything that Luke said, we're focusing on, when we talk about this no wrong, so approach, which ensures that regardless, if you're a young person, regardless of how you're connected into the system, how are you supported? So that includes high school students, individuals that are the post-secondary level or out-of-school youth. We have, 4 million disconnected youth, and so we also want to integrate them into the system as well. But it's also around paid work experience, ensuring that young people have access to paid work-based learning experience. And the third piece would just be around our public-private partnerships, right? We want to ensure that when we talk about this work that we're aligning. And then to that point, not intending it to necessarily be a love fest for ed and labor per se, but we literally on a weekly basis we're engaging. Like one of the things I often say is, when you talk about collaboration, how often do you talk to that other person that you say you're collaborating with? And you say I have a strong collaboration with X. So how often do you really talk to them, right? And so we talk regularly, weekly, and we have cross collaborations. One of the things that, at least for sure that, we've appreciated is when we're articulating, when Luke's talk about some of the work we're doing around incorporating our frameworks, we literally will reach out and say, like, align our languages, get feedback from each other to really align. And so actually, I would just mention, the example from the alignment of the Perkins and apprenticeship as a concrete example, not to, just like as a concrete example of building that. Or our youth system building academy on the workforce side, where we're working with cities, providing technical assistance to build a youth strategy and ensuring that there's alignment with and representation of workforce and education as well. But I could kind of literally go down the list of all the concrete structures to collaborate, and then as part of that structure, what has been the outcome to lead to then the impact that we want to see. So,
and I think that speaks to some of the power that Youth Apprenticeship has as this catalyst, this connector to bring together these disparate agencies, these disparate systems that have been often siloed. There's now all of these reasons, these shared metrics, this shared vision to come together in a way that I don't know has often. But it does require change. It requires that you have to manage a whole lot of people around the country doing something very differently. Luke, when you talk about the increase of work-based learning as a priority through Raise the Bar and other kind of strategies, how are you getting schools to understand that learning doesn't have to always happen in the classroom? In fact, sometimes it shouldn't happen in the classroom.
Yeah, so this I think is actually one of the really interesting debates and things to watch in public education right now. Who's familiar with like Perkins 5? All right, I got a bunch of hands, great. So it's not that old. It introduced 3 new accountability models. One was around work-based learning, the second was around industry credential attainment, and the third was around like early post-secondary learning. And states are able to actually choose which of those 3, one or more, that they would like to adopt in terms of how their state holds itself accountable for the implementation of Perkins 5, right? There are 26 states that selected the work-based learning metric, which is really neat. So it is more than half the country right now is wrestling with how do we create high-quality, robust, work-based learning experience that exist at scale for youth. And I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is really hard to do. Many states have adopted kind of a continuum, so there's kind of exploration and awareness, and then we move into more immersive kind of work-based learning experience, which include things like paid internships and youth apprenticeship, right? Which is wonderful. And things that people are struggling with is how do you engage employers at scale? How do you ensure that learning credit is associated for learning that exists outside the classroom? And how do we make sure that employers and school systems are mutually accountable for the success of a young person in a given community? And as a country, we are really working together to try to figure some of these things out. So what I think is really neat right now is, and where I love youth apprenticeship, is it gives a framework for states to think about this, right? Apprenticeship is thousands of years old, right? It is a model that is easily transferable in terms of education and workforce preparation. And it, again, puts employers and training providers on the same page in terms of how they work together to support student success. So I am wholeheartedly encouraged by youth apprenticeship and its impact in this space, because I do think it is the future of work-based learning, and I do think it is how we scale work-based learning across our country.
You can clap. You're welcome to clap to that. And Manny, you mentioned that diversifying apprenticeship is a huge part of your initiatives, and you mentioned the youth engagement strategies. Right now, the average age of an apprentice in this country is about 30. And when we see other countries who have established these youth apprenticeship systems, or really just apprenticeship systems that are always almost for youth, we're looking at averages in the 20s and sometimes 18, depending on the country. What do we need to do as a country to change that?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that, that would be crucial. The first thing is, and this also goes back to, I harp into some of the conversation with the Apprenticeship Advisory Committee and some of the conversation we're having across agencies around, quite frankly, the integration. So the structure, ensuring that when we talk about registered apprenticeships, when we talk about apprenticeships, youth apprenticeships, that there is a structure to connect to young people, right? And so it's almost as if it's like the averages, right? It's like if we're not connecting, if we don't have a medium to connect to young people, then we could never bring that down, right? And so to do that, then we have to engage, as some of the points I mentioned, to connect secondary and post-secondary systems connected to CTE. But I think there's actually a second component that we're often thinking about and we want to be thoughtful about when we talk about the age, but we're talking about equity. And so I think, we were having a little bit of this conversation offline a little bit earlier, which is, I think, and I'm not that old, so sometimes I'm saying like back in the day, but I think about in like the late 80s or the 90s on the CTE, and this is why I'm bringing this point up. I remember there was a time, because when I was doing some community engagement on youth apprenticeship, I remember going into particularly African American households and talking to literally like students' parents, and they were saying, I don't want my kid to do that because you're trying to do X. And I think about that because, one, we're talking about just how, obviously the diverse population, that we're having an increased diverse population. What I don't want to get missed in the piece is that how we bring in other populations into the conversation in a meaningful way. Because back in the late 80s and 90s, the CTE conversation was you put X group of students and then you put another group of students to this college track. Fast forward, and I was just saying this, I don't know if this is still the case across every state, but I know for quite a few of the states I've worked with, the CTE programs are where it's the highest performing programs. And oftentimes we would talk about how there's a lack of equity. So you didn't have the Black and Hispanic students in those high-performing CTE programs, or you didn't have women in those in those non-traditional IT industry sectors. And so what I think about in terms of worry, but also see as an opportunity when we talk about expanding and diversifying registered apprenticeship, is to not have the same kind of paradigm shift so that's why I also emphasize it's important to build on the quality to make sure it's good, but that as we create these strong, good pathways for youth apprenticeship, that we're actually doing it in a way that actually brings in individuals, and it's 10 years we're not in this panel again, I'll have a little bit, bit balder and say, oh, we have these great programs that we've developed, but, X% of name the population or subgroups is not represented in those programs. And on the flip side, the importance of building the pathway or the road well, we don't want it to be this avenue that was, X subgroup that was shifted into that population. So I think that's another piece, whenever we think about the diversifying, is how we think strategically about it as well. So,
I think that's a great point. And in Colorado, we saw in our first couple cohorts, alumni of CareerWise apprenticeships are averaging $6 an hour more than their counterparts that didn't pursue an apprenticeship in terms of wages. And this is in a community that has a relatively high minimum wage. That dispels that myth that this is only for those kids or other kids. But to your point, we have to keep our eye on that equity piece so that we don't fall into the traps of the occupational segregation that exists across our entire economy. So constantly paying attention to that is so important. And I think you'll hear from employers tomorrow and on Friday here who are really working to change that narrative, to say we as JP Morgan Chase or Accenture are proud of our apprentices and are hiring apprentices that don't look like most of the other staff that we've traditionally gotten out of the higher education system. I know it's time for audience, we're getting close to audience questions. I've been told a couple times that it's time for audience questions. I will get to you, I promise. But I just want to, one last question. You've been doing the Manny and Luke show on the road for a couple years now, and you've seen a lot of what's going on across the country in this space. What are some of the bright spots that we need to be paying attention to? What are some things that you think we need to be scaling? What needs to happen?
So the first thing that I would just point out is leadership matters. Each of you are leaders. Each of you has a voice, and each of you needs to exercise your voice. So I would encourage you to continue to advocate for change and be an advocate of change. And as the New York panel, also I think kind of illustrated, it doesn't hurt to have a mayor or a governor or someone that you're working alongside to help champion the work and the change that you seek to lead. So in places where I think I have seen things move faster, there are some of those executive champions. And you need both a champion from the public sector and a champion from the private sector. You need both, right? So like my experience in Delaware, we had the governor. I also had a guy named Gary Stockbridge, who was the CEO of everything and literally sat on every single board that could exist. He actually ran Delmarva Power, right? So like he was one of the biggest employers in the state. You need both of those people, and both of those people need to move in lockstep in terms of their message. And both need to recruit, right? So you also heard this on the New York panel, is many of you are also employers, right? One of the things that is in your locus of control are your employment, your hiring patterns, your HR patterns. Change them, right? Leverage your purchasing power, again, as demonstrated by New York, so that you are requiring contractors to hire your students. All things within your control. We have to get the little things right, and I think if we get the little things right, you will create momentum for big P policy. And then the other thing I would just point out is, I now have the pleasure of working at the federal level. Advocacy matters, your voice matters. I can't tell you how many times that I respond a day to stakeholder inquiries and letters, right? All of those things are viewed very seriously. So continue to be an advocate for change federally. You do have an executive branch and a president who wants to see this type of work exist in every country in America. So make sure that your voice is heard through many different formats. But again, you are leaders, be a leader. We are happy to support you in that endeavor.
You heard him. And Manny, to the point about inquiry and feedback, there's an opportunity for everyone coming up.
Yes. So this is, if you all follow, I don't know if we have any, reg nerds here. I hope I'm not the only one raising my hand. Ooh, yeah, exactly. We do have on our spring public agenda a update to our apprenticeship regs, 2929. Of course, the registered apprenticeship is two components. 2929 is, and then 2930 is the EEO component. That one was in 2016, but we have a proposed rulemaking that you'll be hearing about soon. That is public on our reg agenda. But what's coming, and this is the piece to be more specific, what's coming is that there'll be an opportunity, if you're not familiar with kind of like the federal kind of regulations, that when we announce and when we publish the proposed rule, there'll be an opportunity for public comment. And this is the opportunity and the time to incorporate and share your comments and feedback. And as we were joking like earlier, literally we have to go through every comment. And so this is a very formal and structural opportunity when we put the proposed rulemaking out on registered apprenticeship to be able to provide those comments. So that's something that just will flag. And then, so that's the opportunity to flag. And then the second thing I'll just quickly mention, and I'm just quite honestly just cheating to throw that in there to add a point to Luke's previous point that I think is really important as like what we're saying. I do want to say like three super fast things. One is, it was really cool when I saw the example. This was in Denver when we were seeing on a youth apprenticeship where the students were able to do kind of rotations early on to actually be exposed. And the only reason why I'm flagging that is because in more operational practice ways, I think I hear when we talk about the equity, families being concerned that, hey, like, are you, again, narrowing? And so ensuring that there's that broad exposure is going to be important. A second really concrete piece I'll mention is in terms of, practices that should be encouraged is this integration and alignment that everybody's at the table like you all are doing here. And the third one, I'll just throw a plug for this one, is because I am always stuck by this line. A few years back, I did a survey, a statewide survey on barriers young people face to training and employment. And I still remember this quote from a student that said, how can we get experience if every job we apply to requires experience? And so it was both a quantitative and then a qualitative aspect. And what I mean by as a best practice, to get specifics to the point, is ensuring that we're engaging with the young people. So the employer and the education workforce stakeholder, quite frankly, they're key. Like, they have to be central. In addition to that, as you're thinking about this, make sure you incorporate the voice or the engagement, the feedback of young people, because I know we're all here young at heart, and so, but there are changes that are happening that we don't want as we're building these kind of policies and practices. We actually do want to know, like, connect to the youth apprentices or prospective youth apprentices to actually hear their perspective to guide the work that we're doing. So I'll just throw that out there as well.
Well, thank you. It's no surprise youth apprenticeship is growing, expanding. This movement is moving when we've got leaders like this in Washington. But I want to hear from you all. They want to hear from you all. Who's got a question? Annalise.
Luke gets the hard questions. I take the easy one.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annalise from Brookings. Good to see you both. I have a question. I think what you're saying about scale is really important. I want to hear your thoughts about what could we do at the federal level to make apprenticeship accessible for small businesses and medium-sized businesses, especially when you're thinking about youth apprenticeship. You have CTE reaching out to employers. You have sometimes youth apprenticeship also reaching out to employers. What is a way to collaborate there to make it, reduce the admin burden and really allow employers to focus on the talent investment?
I think the quick one here is what we're on intermediaries, leveraging intermediaries. So there's both the practical, so you bring up a really good point. And as we know, most businesses are small businesses, right? In most communities, 90% or more, quite frankly, are small businesses. But I think there's an outreach kind of operational piece that I've seen, but then there's also the kind of the practical, like, how do we do it day to day? And for us, I would say we've been leveraging intermediaries across sectors. So we've invested, now we have 20 intermediaries to support starting apprenticeships. So that helps take the burden to, to be super concrete or specific from that small business to focus on that day to day. So leveraging intermediaries, we've been scaling, funding, and investing in intermediaries across sectors, and we just announced new intermediaries a couple months ago. So that's one. I think the second thing is, and this is something that we're continuing to do at the federal level, is modernizing the system. So I think about things like we have our online standards builder now, right? That gets you kind of get like the starter dough, like our Assistant Secretary Brent like to say, like the starter dough to kind of get it going so that it actually accelerates. So you're not spending a lot of time on that upfront piece. Of course, so I think it's leveraging our online tools and some of these new tools that we recently put out or that we're putting out, as well as concrete investment in intermediaries and organizations, or even like what I think about like our hubs investments to actually accelerate and support specifically, again, to your question around small business.
It's the same from my perspective. So a lot of the funds that we have issued, particularly through Perkins, have been traditionally associated with local education agencies and community and technical colleges. Right? Those are the two biggest beneficiaries of Perkins funds. We actually changed some of the rules so that we could directly fund intermediary organizations. So that's evident. We launched a $2.5 million work-based learning challenge. There are 70 communities that this program supports across the country. We essentially we changed the authority so that we could directly give resources to intermediary organizations. The second thing I'd say is our secretary is very keen on practical information to the field. So quite a bit of the work that we're releasing is kind of individual or role focused. So to governors, to mayors, to superintendents, to teachers, to counselors, right? So a lot of it is also like practical ways. And a lot of those resources that we're releasing essentially just talk about the value of partnerships and roles and responsibilities that are complementary across systems.
And I'll just put a plug in for a couple things happening later this week. We have very large companies talking about their apprenticeships, but we also do have some small businesses as well. We've got a panel that's focused on some small businesses across Indiana. We've got Melissa Stowasser here from Trident Technical College in Charleston that does a lot of work with small businesses in South Carolina. So there's other folks here that are talking about small business supports. This is a great place to connect with them.
Hi, I'm Alka Manchanda, Computing for All from Washington, Seattle. I had a question about employer incentives, kind of building up on what she was asking for the small and medium businesses. Are there any plans for those? Like in terms of tax credits, things like that?
All right, so two things, yes. I'll briefly mention one of the strategies that we've been leveraging in our investments that we put out actually literally is employer. That's why when you were saying that, I was like, yes, we do. We have employer incentives actually put into as one strategy or one activity that is an allowable activity is employer incentive. So yes, the short answer is that. Separate on the tax credit, which is a different landscape here I'll mention, is that, of course, as you know, and I don't know if we've had a breakdown of like the funding landscape, states have their own kind of investments, but on the federal side, the one thing I'll mention right now is the Inflation Reduction Act. And within the Inflation Reduction Act, there is actually the tax credit. Now, this is for clean energy. The Inflation Reduction Act, quite frankly, is the largest investment in climate and clean energy in the history of the country. And we've been working closely with Treasury, IRS on the implementation of the IRA. In particular, there's actually 8 of the 10 tax credits if you have registered apprenticeships and prevailing wage that you get a 5-time enhanced credit, tax credit, and 5-time enhanced credit if you're leveraging registered apprenticeships and prevailing wage for 8 of those. So that's a concrete example of at the federal level. Again, that's in the clean energy space, and I could go down to like the requirements, but I'll probably put most of you all to sleep. And so I know y'all want to go to a happy hour in a second, but yes, those are the 2 examples.
The only thing I'd add to that question is if you do want to look at where some of the larger federal investments that are occurring right now, just go to invest.gov. There's literally a real-time map that talks about both leveraged private sector investment as well as all of the public funds through Investing in America, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS and Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act. You would be surprised at the amount of money and the number of companies that are in your locality that are investing heavily in this space. And remember, all of that requires an education and training plan. Right, so they'll start just directly outreach to those companies and say, how can we work together to fulfill your employment needs?
And actually on the funding part, you remind me of something else. And you actually alluded to this, but don't miss this. When Luke referenced bipartisan infrastructure law, CHIPS and science, and I'm talking about the IRA, one of the things about cross-agency collaborations that's happened is through our Good Jobs initiative with Commerce, and our technical assistance, even though the funds went to those other agencies, and this is like super, super concrete example, we're literally working with those agencies. So when they put out their funding, even though the funding is not coming from the Department of Labor, or in some instances, the Department of Education, it's coming from the Department of Transportation, Commerce, Energy, we've provided technical assistance to ensure that the language that we know the education and the workforce system are familiar with on the workforce side is actually embedded in their funding opportunities and NOFOs. So that's actually another reason why, particularly at the state level, to start building, like I say, make friends before you need them, to start engaging with your state kind of transportation office and some of those offices, because they might be putting up funding and you might be saying to yourself, why would there be youth apprenticeship dollars there? We've been providing technical assistance to incorporate those language in their funding opportunities to scale out youth apprenticeships in those contexts, in those particular sectors.
Hello. My name is Louis Reyes from the workplace. It's really exciting to see everybody here today. I'm a product of the New York City public school system, NYU alum, so shout out to them. And I'd like to ask about AI and what impact it'll have on RTI and skills development for youth, because there's a lot of discussion going around in terms of how will this impact future the employers and also the apprentices that are going into these skill jobs, and how will that change over time?
I'll be short because that's a big question. I'll just say all of the previous responses I provided was generated by ChatGPT in my head. So, but I mean, so I won't even pretend to say how much time you have to speak to that, quite frankly. So I'll turn it to Luke. But I will say one quick thing on that is that this is actually something we're talking about and thinking about strategically. Now, I think when you talk about AI, on one part this is the part of our conversation about modernizing it, right? So when I talk about some of the stuff that we're doing, whether it's the standard builders or some of the online, it's leveraging technology to actually better kind of to streamline and operationalize some of the work that we do. So that's one example. Two is, quite frankly, as we're continuing this conversation, we'd love to also hear we don't pretend to have it all figured out or solved. I don't think even no one does. So if you all are hearing something, I guess too, I'd love to chat with you and hear more. But we are actually having these conversations, thinking strategically, what does the impact mean? But first, we're taking a step back to figure out, when we say AI, what does that actually even mean? Because it actually means different things, right? It could be you're talking about a ChatGPT, but it could also just be, I think about leveraging AI for training components, right? And so it means a lot of different things. So I think I need a couple more drinks to really figure out all the components.
I'll just say quickly on the AI for training front specifically. I'm very excited. My colleague back there is jumping up and down excited, because we're looking at how we can use supervisor feedback on rubrics for apprenticeships to help supplement RTI with automated pathways, so that we can start finding little supplemental trainings that come in and help ensure someone's keeping up when they're starting to fall behind before you get to the end. It's oh no, you're not actually skilled enough to complete this apprenticeship. So it's a way to create efficiency and equity through the system, not a way to get rid of jobs necessarily.
I don't have anything to say beyond that. I think it does change the landscape of work, but I do think it makes many more occupations accessible for many, many more people.
Hi, my name is Adenike. I'm with Baltimore City Public Schools. I love seeing both of your agencies show your collaboration on this stage. And I guess my question is, how are you supporting or helping states, education departments and labor departments with a strategy on cross-collaboration, as well as defining youth apprenticeship? Because I'm in a state where we're struggling with how are we going to define it, and I don't know how the federal agencies are supporting states in that way, also in helping states bring their labor and education departments together, and how do we actually create a strategy around youth to adult apprenticeship as an economic multiplier like we talk about in this conference?
So I actually had dinner with Richard Kincaid, who's your state CT director, on Monday. So the relationship between states is very real, and it's one that's very fluid. And Maryland, if you're not familiar with Maryland has a new blueprint for success, which I think by 2030 requires, or school systems are expected to have 50% of their high school graduates having completed a youth apprenticeship program. Is that the number? 45. I was close. So we are actually working quite a bit. So Maryland is a really good example. We're working both with practitioners at the state institutions. Baltimore is also a workforce hub for the Biden-Harris administration. So essentially that is a rallying point across multiple federal partners: transportation, labor, education, energy, commerce, right? So that we are collectively investing in these communities to make sure that all of our leverage, expertise, and knowledge is essentially brought to scale in a place. But it also helps us to learn very quickly how public policy can be scaled in other communities across the country. So this is the type of policy relationship that we want to have with places.
And I'll say on the DOL side, I'll say the most exciting word you probably want to hear: guidance. Youth guidance. It's disseminating guidance. So we actually, if you're not familiar with our youth TEGL, our youth guidance that we put out, that one was providing clarity to states. So essentially the relationship federal, state, and local, right? One of the main ways we communicate and disseminate is through guidance. So 3 concrete ways. One is putting guidance out, and that's helping to align the language. So the reference to the youth TO I mentioned, it is, if you take a look at it, you'll literally see like how we're thinking strategically about and how we hope states to align. So like, for example, mental health. And clarifying certain things that yes, you can use WIOA funding to support for certain services. So that's one. 2, technical assistance, and so that's things as our Good Jobs, Great Cities, the hubs that Luke's referenced, our youth system building academy, where we're bringing cross partners together to literally think about what are their plans for youth, for young people, and supporting that through the federal level, so that's technical assistance. And the third one is like through our investments, when we explicitly call out youth apprenticeships or pre-apprenticeship as funding, as allowable funding. So those are like the 3 concrete way I would say at the labor side we're thinking about it.
This is the last question.
Hi there, so Allison Gerber with the Annie Casey Foundation. Good to see you again, Manny. As you probably remember, last time I asked you a question, I was concerned about, we'd been hearing from some apprenticeship navigators that they'd been hearing from young people were opting out of youth apprenticeship because they were concerned that their income would be counted in the household income of their parents and that they wouldn't be eligible for housing and other benefits assistance. And so I've been particularly concerned about this question and have been investigating it. And we since have been hearing from the state of Maryland a similar challenge with regards to SNAP benefits, that there's an interpretation on behalf of some folks that families' eligibility for SNAP, the income of a youth apprentice would be taken into account. And I think I'm fairly certain, I could be wrong, I'm not a Fed like you all, but that's an inaccurate interpretation. That is not federal law. There are income calculations that are occurring that are inaccurate. And so what my question is there some way we can work together with your colleagues at HUD and HHS to do a myth buster? Because it can't be that young people, opt out of this amazing opportunity because they're afraid that it's going to hurt their families.
Yes, let's work on it. Let's continue. Yes. And I'll just say this really quickly, so one, I recall this conversation, and this is a conversation, particularly on the benefits cliff, quite frankly, that's happening across systems, particularly young people and adults as well. That's a conversation that's happening that we've been hearing. But specific to that, it actually aligns to one of our secretary's main initiative, which is around the Yes, We Owe a Can. Like, how do we actually go from this is what you can't do versus nothing actually says that you can't do this. And I'll even say a specific analogy that I like to say is, when I was at the state, I used to write letters to the same people that I'm working with now, and I was like, XYZ says you can't do X, you can't do something, and then you realize like nothing in the law actually says you can't do certain things. So this is also why when I talk about the guidance and the TA, that's why it's important. But to be super like concrete and direct, let's follow up. Let's schedule a follow-up call and discussion on this, and I'll coordinate to make sure other folks are in attendance.
So I'd love to join that. So we've been working with USDA directly on public benefits access for students who are enrolled in college and dispelling essentially like, a college student, a traditional college student today is a 28-year-old individual, right? Many of whom have families, many of whom have dependents, right? It is not a 22-year-old student who, is using a SNAP benefit to offset their cost for like beer money, right? That is not who today's post-secondary student is. We need to change that mentality, like that mental image, but frankly, it's about success, right? We need students to complete high-quality programs like youth apprenticeship, right? And access to public benefits and basic needs supports is one way that we can make that happen.
This is progress in action. This is why we come together. Manny, Luke, you two represent the leadership that we need in this country. The work that we need to do here is complex and hard, and you two are guiding us through it. So thank you for spending the time with us, for the work you do in Washington, and for spending and answering these questions.
And thank you all, quite frankly. Thank you to y'all, and thank you to the network for the work that you're doing in convening and connecting folks and getting, so seriously, thank you.
I would also like to thank Paya and New America and CareerWise. Thank you, guys.